Well, I mean, yeah, I can't go for a drive without a random person just yanking me out of my car and taking my car and then driving over 10 cops immediately.
Hello, fellow netizens, and welcome to Scandalous Games, the show where we take a closer look at video game-related controversies. I'm Kevin Impellizzeri, and I do the research and share a story of a video game-related controversy to my friends.
I'm Alfred Stevens. I'm just a guy who's passionate about video games.
My name's Phil Thomas. I'm a recent convert to PS4 and computer gaming, so you might as well consider me a video game newbie.
Hey, my name is Andy Hunter. I'm a medium gamer. I've been playing games since the 80s, almost exclusively on Nintendo.
We are going to talk about Brown v. Entertainment Merchants Association, aka Brown v. EMA, which was a landmark 2011 Supreme Court case that granted video games free speech protection in the United States. Now, how versed are we all in constitutional law?
I'm blinking.
It's been a bit. I've got a copy back there, but it's a little dusty. So,
Andy, that's actually why we brought you onto this episode. We thought you were a constitutional scholar.
Wait, you're not?
I may have inflated a little bit of my experience on my resume.
You're still going to represent me for that traffic case, right?
Oh, yeah, I got you. Don't worry. Don't worry.
This one's a wild journey of how we got to the point where video games could actually qualify for free speech protection. So buckle up, because we're going to take a deep dive into violent video game laws, video games in the courts, and we also may even meet some familiar faces along the way. Our exciting journey through the legal system begins with a man named Leland Yi. Yi was born on November the 20th, 1948 in Taishan in China's Guangdong province. When he was 3 years old, Leland's family relocated to California, eventually settling in San Francisco's Mission District. Leland attended Mission High School, followed by 2 years at San Francisco City College, before earning a bachelor's degree at Berkeley, a master's from San Francisco State University, and a PhD in child psychology from the University of Hawaii. He practiced as a child psychologist for a few years in the early 1980s before transitioning to politics. In 1986, he made an unsuccessful run for San Francisco County School Board. However, he won 2 years later and served on the county school board for 8 years. In 1996, Yi was elected to the San Francisco County Board of Supervisors, followed by the California State Assembly in 2002, where he became the first Asian American to be elected president pro temp of the California State Assembly. While in politics, Yi developed a reputation of, let's say, ideological inconsistency. And observers really found it hard to pin down Yi's loyalties on various political issues. As a 2011 article in the San Francisco Bay Guardian described him, quote, Leland Yi is a political puzzle. He's a Chinese immigrant who has built a political base almost entirely outside of the traditional Chinatown community. He's a politician who once represented a deeply conservative district, opposed tenant protections, voted against transgender health benefits, and sided with Pacific Gas and Electric Company on key environmental issues, and now has the support of some of the most progressive organizations in the city. He's taken large sums of campaign money from some of the worst polluters in California, but gets high marks from the Sierra Club. His roots are as a fiscal conservative, yet he's been the only Democrat in Sacramento to reject budget compromises on the grounds that they required too many spending cuts. He's grown, changed, and developed his positions over time, or he's become an expert at political pandering, telling every group exactly what it wants to hear, unquote. However, were you to ask Yi, he would tell you that two of his key issues as a lawmaker were the well-being of children and government transparency. We'll talk about that one later.
He sounds like the perfect politician. Like, everybody believes he's on their team. For a while there, I was going to vote for Leland Yi.
When Leland Yi joined the California legislature, he became a vocal critic of video games, arguing that the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, that's the game industry's rating system, was ineffective at protecting children from the damaging effects of violent video games. For example, in response to the scandal over the Grand Theft Auto San Andreas hot coffee mod, which will be a future episode, Yi commented in 2005, quote, clearly the ESRB has a conflict of interest in rating these games, plain and simple. Parents cannot trust the ESRB to rate games appropriately or the industry to look out for our children's best interests. And Yi generally viewed the ESRB as kind of a fox guard in the hen house. And he felt like the only solution to that was government oversight. To that end, on February the 22nd, 2005, Yi introduced introduced AB 1179 to the California State Assembly. The bill banned the sale or rental of violent video games to anyone under the age of 18. It also required any video game with violent or sexually explicit content to bear a big old 2-inch by 2-inch label on the front of the packaging with 18 printed on it to warn parents and retailers of this game's naughty content, with violators subject to a fine of up to $1,000.
This type of law, these restrictions, is this the same way that they're restricting adult entertainment sort of material? What I mean is like the $1,000 penalty. That's similar.
I don't know, but I imagine it is similar.
Because it seems, on one hand, it seems reasonable to try to encourage salespeople not to sell violent games to kids and to have some penalty for it.
Just to interject, if that 2-by-2-inch label works anything like the parental advisory label on CDs back in the day, that's how you'll tell which video games are good and which ones are not.
This bill passed pretty easily through the California legislature and was signed into law by Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger on October the 7th, 2005. And here I feel the need to point out that this is the same man who made his career on over-the-top violent action movies, who 2 years prior lent his voice to the video game adaptation of Terminator 3 Rise of the Machines, a T-rated first-person shooter that probably would have to bear the 18 label under this new law. 10 days later, representatives of the video game and electronic retail industries filed an injunction, temporarily blocking the law and leaving up to the courts to decide whether AB 1179 could legally be enforced. Now, this clash between lawmakers and the games industry was far from the first, and video game-related legislation dates back in some shape or form to the 1970s and early 1980s. However, most of the time during the 70s and 80s, video game-related laws focused primarily on regulating the public spaces games occupied rather than on their content. So there's a lot of concern about arcades and this corrupting influence of the arcade space. You know, like kids are going to start skipping school to stay all day at the arcades, and they're going to shake kids down and rob them for their quarters so they can play more Galaxian or Centipede or whatever. And that arcades are going to be havens for things like petty crime, gangs, and drug dealing and things like that. As a result of that, a lot of video game related legislation in the 70s and 80s focused on local legislation. So for example, local zoning ordinances imposed restrictions like limiting the number of cabinets that could appear in a given space, limiting how close arcades could be in proximity to schools, or restricting when minors could access arcade or coin-operated games. So things like curfews, banning minors from arcades during school hours, or requiring adult supervision and things like that. And a lot of these regulations stem from those concerns about what people were doing at the arcades, not so much what the games were. That changed during the 1990s, when the concerns over video games largely shifted away from the spaces games occupied to the content that they actually have. Yee's bill was part of a surge in video game legislation that had begun in the late 1990s, with lawmakers specifically targeting children's access to violent video games, broadly defined. This was inspired in no small part to the backlash against video games in the wake of the Columbine shooting. So on April the 20th, 1999, 2 students at Columbine High School go on a shooting spree, killing 12 students and 1 teacher, wounding about 20 others, and then the shooters also took their own lives. In what was then the worst school shooting in U.S. history, a record Americans have been depressingly determined to break. In the aftermath of Columbine, members of the press, pundits, and lawmakers started turning their focus to video games, suggesting or insinuating that violent video game play had influenced the shooters, that either it allowed them to practice and hone their, murderous craft, or somehow it warped their minds and turned them into violent killers. And as a result of that, there began to be a bunch of legislation to try to combat access for minors specifically to violent video games. And as a result of that, there were a huge surge of laws. Between 2000 and 2002, lawmakers introduced bills regulating access to violent video games in at least 16 states. And so Yee's bill in California was just one of several riding this particular wave of video game-related moral panic. Many of them end up going nowhere. They're kind of reactionary laws. They're built out of a moral panic. Something needs to be done about that. And see if some lawmaker saying, I'll show you what I'm doing about this. I'm going to introduce this law. But then oftentimes that's all that happens. They die in committee. They don't go very far. They never even go to a vote. However, a choice few did manage to get passed into law, and they now had to be litigated in the courts. So the first of these bills to successfully pass, and the first of them to make it into the courts, was Indianapolis Ordinance number 72, which the Indianapolis, Indiana City Council passed on July the 17th, 2000. The ordinance banned arcades from allowing unaccompanied minors from playing any video game that contained, quote, graphic violence, unquote, or quote unquote, strong sexual content, and required arcade owners to post signs warning patrons of the game's possible objectionable content. If the site had 5 or more such games that qualified for that, they had to be separated from other titles with a partition where minors could not see or access them, and violators were subject to fines and ran the risk of losing their operator's license in Indianapolis. In August of 2000, representatives of the coin-operated industry mounted a challenge, and while a federal court ruled in the city's favor, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals struck the law down, arguing it violated game manufacturers' right to free speech. Now, the Indianapolis City Council did appeal to the Supreme Court, but they declined to hear it in October of 2001. And with the Indianapolis ordinance, thus began a complex dance in the courts between lawmakers and the video game industry. And over the next decade or so, the industry was effectively playing whack-a-mole with lawmakers. Laws would pop up and they've got to try to tamp them down and challenge them in the courts. Between 2000 and 2009, including the Indianapolis case, there were at least half a dozen violent video game cases argued in the federal courts. Do we want to make a guess, like an over-under, how many of these laws end up being upheld by the courts?
I'm going to say 0.
I'm guessing 1 or 2, because I feel like if it went to the Supreme Court, they might have been trying to settle like disparate decisions at the lower level.
So I would have originally said 6. Fuck it. They were all upheld. They all became law.
Well, one of you is correct, and it's Elford. None of them were upheld.
What?
0 of them were upheld. I feel like I should give you at least a brief primer. If a state law is challenged, what's the process by this? So if a law is passed in a state, people who feel like it violates various constitutional rights can then appeal to that. If it is, it's brought up to the U.S. federal court system. And they'll have an argument about that. And the federal judge will rule whether or not they feel it's constitutional. And either party could then appeal that to the higher court, which is the U.S. Circuit Courts of Appeals. And whether or not a ruling is upheld or not, they could then appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, at their discretion, can decide whether or not to take up a case with largely the impetus whether or not it decides on a specific constitutional right. Now, not all cases that end up going through the federal court system end up in the Supreme Court, as we saw with the Indianapolis ordinance. But yeah, going back to Elford, none of these are upheld. And so I'm going to play the hits for you. One, because I'm not going to devote a huge amount of time to each one of the cases. And the other part is that in a lot of cases, the laws that they're arguing are functionally the same. Some even borrow the same language. And a little later on, I'll explain why they fail as a group, because they kind of argue the same things. But we'll go through some of the laws first. We're going to Missouri next. On October the 26th, 2000, the city of St. Louis, Missouri passed Ordinance 2193, which banned the sale, rental, display of, or access to, quote, graphically violent video games, end quote, to minors without a parent or guardian present. The Interactive Digital Software Association, that was the video games trade organization now called the Entertainment Software Association, sued the city of St. Louis. And in April of 2002, a federal district court judge upheld the law, arguing that video games had, quote, no conveyance of ideas, expression, or anything else that could possibly amount to free speech, end quote. And I feel like it's worth mentioning the name of the judge who ruled on this was a guy named Stephen Limbaugh. And yes, he was a cousin to Rush. However, the Eighth Circuit Court of Appeals disagreed with Rush's cousin, and on June the 3rd, 2003, the U.S. Court of Appeals ruled the St. Louis law violated the First Amendment. On May the 20th, 2003, Washington State enacted a law banning the sale of video games that depicted violence against law enforcement officials. So if your game had violence against a cop, it was illegal in Washington State. As part of the law, business that sold or rented video games that covered it had to put up a great big sign in at least 72-point font that warned it was illegal to sell or rent violent video games to minors. And I will specifically say that it didn't ban them entirely. It banned any game that depicted violence against law enforcement officials in a game from being sold to minors. And the U.S. federal court struck this one down on July the 15th, 2004 on the grounds that it violated free speech.
Kevin, let me make sure I understand you clearly.
Sure.
So in Washington State, this law, it was like specially interpreting one situation in which a game has violence towards law enforcement and saying that cannot be sold to children.
Exactly. Let's skip ahead to 2005, where we're going to the great state of Illinois. On July the 25th, 2005, Illinois Governor Rod Blagojevich signed a law making it illegal to sell or rent a violent video game to minors. Like Yee's bill in California, this one required any games with violent content to have a big old 2x2-inch sticker marked with 18 on the front of the package. This one also required big signs explaining the ESRB ratings within 5 feet of wherever video games were displayed. The Entertainment Software Association challenged the law, and a federal district judge ruled the law unconstitutional on December the 2nd, 2005.
Isn't Rod Blagojevich the guy who's in prison for corruption?
I believe Trump pardoned him, but yeah, he was in prison for corruption.
Yeah, I think he was taking bribes. But yes, I do at least recall that he was, I believe, a contestant on The Celebrity Apprentice.
He was impeached in 2009 on abuse of power and corruption. He was convicted and removed from office. Yeah, he was on The Celebrity Apprentice in season 9 in spring of 2010. On February 18, 2020, Trump commuted Blagojevich's 14-year corruption sentence.
Okay. Well, I mean, he may have went to jail, but at least he got those fucking video games.
So yeah, Rod Blagojevich, who later on was removed as governor of Illinois for massive corruption, passed a law banning video games to minors and put in all great big old signs reminding everybody about the Entertainment Software Ratings Board. And a federal judge ruled the law unconstitutional on December the 2nd, 2005. Nearly a year later, on November the 27th, 2006, the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals double-tapped that bill, affirming the lower court's ruling. And they said, on top of it violating the First Amendment, like all the other ones we've seen so far, the ESA successfully argued that the state's 18 label, one, it contradicted the ESRB ratings. Because which are you supposed to believe? Are you supposed to believe an 18 sticker that the state of Illinois says, or the M for mature rating, which is 17 and up? And if there are games that have, say, violent content that aren't M rated, like T rated games, which one are you supposed to believe? And that was a big sticking point about that. The other thing was that the amount of signage needed to enforce the law was laughably impractical. On September the 14th, 2005, the Michigan state legislature on that day passed its own violent video game law banning the sale of, quote, ultra-violent, explicit games. I appreciate the extra adjectives for this one. Michigan's law was unique in that it imposed some of the harshest penalties for violations. So many of them were fines. In Michigan, the fine was up to $5,000 for the first offense, $15,000 for the second offense, and at least $40,000 and up for additional offenses. That was really on the high end. Most were like between $1,000 and $5,000. On top of that, a rental or video store owner was also potentially subject to up to 93 days of imprisonment.
So just to confirm, this is fewer days in prison than if you're a governor convicted of massive corruption.
That seems to be the size of it.
I don't know if you know this off the top of your head, but do you know if the proposed legislation is basically 50-50 liberal conservative being proposed, or is it largely by one party or the other?
I'm really glad you asked that. And what's really fascinating about violent video games as a political issue is they're quite bipartisan.
Mm-hmm.
The bills that we're talking about, you're going to hear them push from both Republicans and Democrats. Leland Lee was a Democrat, but some of the others were Republicans. So it's kind of bipartisan. I think in part because at this time, it's an easy way to look like you're really looking out for the welfare of children at a time when video games don't really have a lot of adequate public defense. And at this point, you probably couldn't say, I'm going to ban certain movies, but you could still get away with that with video games in 2005. So both parties are going at this.
Okay, that explains a lot about why there was this groundswell after Columbine, because everybody's rushing to make these almost superficial or ineffective laws to show how moral they are.
Yeah, there's this kind of instinct of something must be done. And this shows that something is being done. You know, so-and-so can then go to their constituents and say, I fought for kids. Mm-hmm. Probably some of them also know that these things aren't going to fly. But, you know, people are going to see, oh, it passed this thing, and they're not going to pay attention to this as it makes its way through the courts, unless you're really, really into video games. Going back to the Michigan law, this one was thrown out by the courts in April of 2006. But speaking of moral conservatives, you know who also got into the video game legislation business?
I'm excited. Someone
that we may know from past episodes who had a long-standing beef with video games and some access to the legal system. The entrance music is turning on, and we are welcoming into the ring Mr. Jack Thompson.
Yay, Jack. Thank you so much. Thank you. Come on home.
not content with simply suing the games industry and engaging in petty feuds online, including once commissioning a video game where you could have all of his enemies killed. And for that, see our two-part episode on Jack Thompson. Jack Thompson was also determined to waste people's time with his bullshit in at least 2 state legislatures. We begin in Louisiana. On March the 15th, 2006, Louisiana Representative Ray Burrell introduced HB 421. Drafted by Thompson himself, or at least with consultation from Jack Thompson, the bill basically did what all of the other ones did that we've talked about. So it imposed penalties for selling or renting violent video games to anyone under the age of 18, M rating be damned. However, this bill also got some of that characteristic Jack Thompson flair. It included a penalty of up to 1 year in prison, quote, with or without hard labor. You can be sent for hard labor to Baton Rouge jail just for selling Grand Theft Auto to a 17-year-old.
Wow.
The bill passed because, of course, it did. And Louisiana Governor Kathleen Babineau Blanco signed it into law on June the 15th, 2006.
Assuming this one also got struck down like the others.
Yeah, this one got tossed out too. On August the 24th, 2006, Judge James J. Brady of the Middle District of Louisiana ruled that Thompson's bill was unconstitutional because it, survey says, violated the First Amendment, like all the other ones did, citing numerous previous cases we've already mentioned as a growing body of precedent against these laws. Judge Brady later expressed surprise that the state of Louisiana even bothered, given the fact that every single one of these had failed so far, saying, quote, the court wonders why nobody objected to the enactment of this statute. In this court's view, the taxpayers deserve more from their elected officials. Thompson, meanwhile, knew when he was beaten. He thanked the Louisiana Attorney General's office, expressing his appreciation for their valiant, albeit unsuccessful efforts to protect the children of the Pelican State. Yeah, I'm just kidding. He accused Louisiana Attorney General Charles Feuds and his team of, quote, taking a dive, end quote. In a letter to Ars Technica, Thompson called the Louisiana Attorney General's office, quote, at best incompetent and at worst compromised.
Jack is always a fountain of gratefulness.
Thompson wasn't quite done yet. In 2007, he was at it again, this time in Utah. There he teamed with State Representative Scott L. Wyatt, who, after failing to push a bill to get violent video games reclassified as pornography, turned to the legal genius that is Mr. Jack Thompson.
Wait, what?
Yes, you heard that correctly.
How could you possibly make that argument?
We'll talk about that.
There's some people that's turned on to this stuff.
Yeah, I think this is a real insight into Jack Thompson's just inner thoughts and feelings,
You could redefine anything as pornography.
And you know what? No shame, as long as it's all consensual and no real people getting hurt.
We'll talk about that a little bit later because it kind of ties into what the rationale for a lot of these laws were. But yeah, try to get this redefined as pornography, brings in Jack Thompson to try to polish this up and make this thing work because, he has a huge track record of success at this point. And together they introduced the bill on January the 15th, 2007, which amended the state's criminal code to get violent video games classified as harmful to minors. However, this time around, Jack Thompson faced some resistance in the form of Utah Attorney General Mark Shurtleff. A fellow Republican, Shurtleff was no fan of video games by any stretch. A year earlier, Shurtleff was one of several law enforcement officials to publicly denounce the game 25 to Life for its violent content. So this guy's an open critic of video games too. However, his personal opinions on video games notwithstanding, he was also aware that every bill like this attempted in other states had failed. And during a hearing on the bill, Shurtleff expressed justifiable concerns about this bill, explaining that even if it passed, it would probably fail in the courts like every other one had. And you know what? This actually got through to Jack Thompson. He realized Shurtleff was right. He withdrew his support from the bill, thanked the Utah Attorney General for looking out for the taxpayer.
Sounds like Jack has made a change of heart. He's starting to become mature.
Yeah, maybe we were mistaken about Jack Thompson, Alfred.
We shouldn't have said so many bad things about him.
This is where I put down the Uno reverse card because just kidding, he tried to get Shurtleff impeached. On January the 21st, 2007, Jack Thompson wrote a letter to Greg J. Curtis, Speaker of the Utah House of Representatives, demanding he file articles of impeachment against Shurtleff for, quote, bad-mouthing bills proposed in the Utah legislature, end quote, In another public letter, Thompson also accused Shurtleff of drunkenly calling him on the phone and launching into a tirade where he called Jack, quote, a liar and a narcissist. Shurtleff denied the accusation, citing Thompson's prolific and I will say well-documented history of making false statements.
Yeah, I think the false part was that the Attorney General was completely sober and in his right mind when he called him to chew him out, right?
While covering the story, the gaming news blog Game Politics wrote to Jack Thompson and asked for his comments on the clash with Shurtleff. Thompson, I should add, was a regular contributor in Game Politics' comment section who frequently argued with people there. And this is going to become relevant in a second. Thompson replied, quote, listen, goofball, Scott Wyatt today endorsed everything I said. Secondly, morons like Shurtleff need to be called out as morons. The bill has no chance of surviving as a law if Shurtleff scuttles it, end quote. Now, you remember what I said just a minute ago about Jack Thompson being a regular on Game Politics' message boards? This is where this becomes relevant. He edited his message, quote, finally, if you weren't such a coward and would allow me to access to your site, you'd know even more about what is going on. You are absurd.
I'm not sure I understand. Is he denying that he comments in the comments section all the time? Or is he saying that he got banned?
So they kicked him off and he's pissed off because they banned him. That's what he's mad about when he's calling him absurd. I did a little digging to try to figure out exactly what got Jack Thompson banned. And apparently he started pressuring the admins to give the personal information of people he was arguing with in the comments. And they banned his IP address for that.
Wow.
But it sounds like Jack Thompson has a problem with when somebody's free speech is limited. Huh. But that doesn't actually sound relevant to what we're talking about.
So Scott Wyatt, the guy who introduced the bill, despite Jack Thompson's claims, withdrew his support from the bill, drafting instead a non-binding resolution that basically just called upon the Utah State Attorney General's office to help other state attorneys generals if they had to defend laws against video games. So it's like, you know what? Yeah, Utah's on your side so long as we don't have to do any of the work on that. And they proposed this to the state legislature and they rejected that one too. That, alas, ends our Jack Thompson segment of the podcast. So you might want to know why these bills fail over and over and over again. So I'm going to go into a little detail about why they fail, because the appeals courts and the circuit courts, when they make their rulings, explain why they do it. And one thing that's really interesting, again, because a lot of these laws are drafted in many cases the same or very similar ways, is that they basically are rejected for the same reasons. So I'll try to keep it brief, but it's important to know that the laws were functionally identical, often borrowing the same wording. And what's interesting about this is they're building this body of precedent, which the court can reference. And because the appeals court and the circuit court and the Supreme Court are built on precedent. How did other courts rule on these issues? So let's talk about what are the ways that these laws are trying to argue that their law can be passed and can be constitutional. And I will, again, we joked about this at the outset of the show. I'm just going to make another disclaimer. I am not a legal expert. I am not a legal historian. I'm not a lawyer, and I'm nothing close to an expert. So I'm going to do this as a layperson's understanding of First Amendment law. And if people see corrections who are listening, send them my way. scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. The violent video game laws of the 2000s tend to rely on 5 key arguments as the reason for these laws, which I'll just one at a time and briefly explain why they failed to persuade the courts that aren't run by Rush Limbaugh's cousin. The first one, and this goes back to the question of pornography, is that video game violence is obscene. Now, the courts have been really, really reluctant to limit access to free speech, with one exception: obscenity. Now, obscenity can be kind of hard to define. And in fact, in 1964, Supreme Court Justice Potter Stewart famously explained that he could not define obscenity, but, quote, I know it when I see it. But you can't exactly rely on gut feelings in the law. So eventually, the Supreme Court built a criterion for measuring obscenity, and it's called the Miller test. This is based on a 1973 Supreme Court decision in what's called Miller v. California. And the Miller test is based on 3 prongs that determines whether or not something is obscene. The first prong is whether the average person applying contemporary community standards would find the work taken as a whole appeals to the prurient interest. And prurient is defined generally as having or encouraging an interest in sexual matters. So that it appeals to sexual interests is prong number 1.
I appreciate you defining that for us, because I was just going to nod my head and pretend knew what it meant, so I would look smart.
I had to look it up too. Don't worry about it. So that's problem number one, that appeals to the prurient interest. So it appeals to sexual matters based on contemporary community standards. Number two is whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual content specifically defined by the applicable law. So the law defines a sort of offensive content that is sexual. And then number three is whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. So this is the general metric by which the courts will rule on cases that involve free speech and obscenity in particular. So primarily, the only times that the court has really upheld rulings of free speech, and there are exceptions, again, not a constitutional lawyer here, the Miller test has only really held up when it comes to sexuality. So limiting pornography to children. Those kinds of things, of course, say, yeah, you can ban access to minors and you can fine people for that. But the problem is that so many of these violent video game laws tried to redefine the Miller test for violence, which doesn't work that way. In fact, if you read the laws, oftentimes they define violence using the Miller test and just scratching out different parts of it and inserting video game violence. So instead of appealing to prurient interest, it appeals to violent interest. And basically what the court says, you can't do that. You can't just scratch out parts of it and have it still work. And on top of that, it's like usually when pushed, the courts will say, you know what? It's not like we would restrict all violence to children. And like, it's not like even stuff that they have to read in school. Like the Bible has tons of violence in it. The Iliad, the Odyssey, the Divine Comedy, Grimm fairy tales, Shakespeare are things that we think are okay for children to have and will even enrich them intellectually. And they're chock full of violence.
I mean, also half the cartoons that are geared specifically towards young children in the 80s and 90s, G.I. Joe, Transformers, all of the DC cartoons.
But I think the difference is video games don't end with a 30-second segment explaining that you should look both ways before you cross the street, wherein then the child says, and now we know, and then like Duke Nukem says, and knowing is half the battle. You know, that's...
Wait, hold up. You are supposed to look both ways? I thought pedestrians
I
had
am.
right away.
I don't care whether or not you do it.
I want those PSAs at like the end of a Mortal Kombat cartoon where it's the severed head of Scorpion.
Don't jump on Goomba's heads.
We need to ban Super Mario and like right quick because he is telling us to stomp on people's heads.
So Kevin, so to bring it back, there are clearly violent cartoons geared towards children, and there are movie ratings, R, PG-13, to try to limit kids' access to that type of content in movies. Now, are these laws trying to bring video games on par with movie ratings, or are they trying to punish access to these things in a way that's above and beyond other current obscenity precedents for other media?
I'm nodding my head.
Glad you asked that. And skipping ahead, is that one of the things they try to argue is that video games are different than these other things, that they are a worse threat, and that's why they need to be treated differently. So like if you're reading the Iliad versus playing God of War, and that one of those actions is different and the interactive nature of it makes it different, and therefore we need to treat it differently. So they're arguing generally that video games need to be treated as a special case in media, that they're not like film, that they're not like books, that they're not like theater, that they are a category into themselves. And that's why it's okay to restrict them in a way that other media can't be. And part of that also kind of gets to a larger interest of some of these people, which is going back to what Stephen Limbaugh's arguing, which is that video games have no cultural value, and arguing that this particular thing, that there's no redeeming thing about this.
He says video games have no cultural value.
That's kind of the larger argument. It's like if video games are different and video games are interactive, then video games can be treated differently in terms of the law, which the courts don't agree with.
I mean, to play devil's advocate, though, who would know better than recognizing something that lacks cultural value than a Limbaugh, though?
Point taken. So you really put this thing in context for us. I'm not a guy who spent a lot of time paying attention to all legal battles and stuff. I've just been clicking my thumbs all these years, really enjoying video games. But it sounds like what you said was basically they're trying to do something different with video games. The whole time I'm trying to figure out what's really going on, and I've been thinking about movies, and Phil's question really stimulated that. When I go into the movie store, I can't get an adult movie. I've got to go somewhere separate for that. There are no video games that have that type of content. You don't see those film stars making video games. They might, but I've never seen them. They would be in that room too. Everything else that you can see in a video game, you can see in a Hollywood movie. It doesn't seem harmful for movies that are more violent to be in a separate space, and doesn't seem more harmful for video games that are more violent to be at least displayed so that these are the mature movies over here. But it does seem harmful to me if video games are being treated differently than the other forms of media. And I think that's what I'm seeing here as my issue. Otherwise, it's going to be up to the culture of the people around as to what they really want.
This is assuming that we're focusing on violence for, like, say, an R-rated movie or an M-rated game. And the question a lot of these laws has is where the line is like if a T-rated game has been rated as T by the Entertainment Software Ratings Board, if they say something is T-rated, but under a specific state law, they say, well, this is violent enough that it's going to be an 18 thing. That's a lot of the question is where the line is on this and how well you can enforce that stuff. But going back to what I was saying before, is like a lot of what the courts are saying is there's violence in lots of forms of media that we find acceptable towards children. Everything from the Bible to Bugs Bunny would be considered children's entertainment, which has violence, and there's been a lot of concerns to that, but is video games different from that? And should we just have no violence away from children? And in fact, there was a line that came out of the Indianapolis case, which got repeated a lot in the other cases as they're building precedent, which argued that it's probably damaging if we were trying to limit kids' access to any violence. This is from one of the judges in that case. So, quote, people are unlikely to become well-functioning, independent-minded adults and responsible citizens if they're raised in an intellectual bubble. To shield children right up to the age of 18 from exposure to violent descriptions and images would not only be quixotic, but deforming. It would leave them unequipped to cope with the world as we know it.
Yeah. Also, who would fight our wars for us? Oh, wait. Oh, shit. I wasn't supposed to say that out loud.
Phil, you said the quiet part again.
Fuck. I said the quiet part loud and the loud part quiet. But I mean, this is something we as a country, we can't limit children's access to violence because we need impressionable children to enlist in the army to fight our wars for us because we're the world's police force. Like, if people stopped enlisting in the army, America's position in the world, not protection of the homeland, but like we would have a very serious problem in terms of trying to push back on all of the geopolitical issues and fronts that we're battling in the world. So unequivocally, we need to encourage children to be desensitized to violence. And second, I think the key here is no cultural value. It's easy for people to do this because what they're saying is, I have no context for whatever this technology or medium is. So every time a new medium comes out, this battle will be fought over and over again. It's like if AR or VR hits a tipping point, politicians and public figures who did not grow up with AR or VR as a child will be like, oh my God, like what's different about this is like the titties are right there and they're really round. It's just not 2D. It's right. It's like, bam, this is too far. Generation is going to be like, yeah, I saw VR titties when I was a kid and it was fine. It's everywhere. Who cares? Just ignore it. Like the same exact way we're dealing with video games now. When I see no cultural value, that's exactly what my mind jumps to.
Yeah, I hate to be trite, and because everybody makes the same argument, which is the argument of video games was made going on 40 years ago from heavy metal music and rap. And before that, it was rock and roll. And before that, it was comic books. And before that, it was dime novels. And before that, it was just printed novels in general. That, yeah, every generation feels anxious for the way people are getting information relative to the way they did it. It happens over and over and over again. And I feel like your point is well met there. It's video games now. It's going to be something else in 10, 15 years or whatever, where this thing is different and it's scary and I don't understand it.
So another angle is that every generation has new parents that are then trying their hardest to figure out how to raise a child to be well adapted for the world that they're going to grow into. It's a scary thing, and it's a difficult thing because this generation has not done it before. And all these new medias present new challenges that you have to kind of walk through. What can my child be exposed to? What's going to be harmful? What's not? And it would be nice to have guidance from wise ones to help us figure this out. Now, one of the things I've come to realize in my own life is that sadly, violence is a part of life. But at the same time, there is an extreme. And so every single person actually has to decide how much of that they want to incorporate into their life and how they want to balance it.
But I mean, it sounds like you're advocating for parents to be taking a role in their child's lives and being informed. And it's really hard for the government to solve that problem. I mean, it's much easier to just slap a label on something or say this isn't allowed.
Can I just say one thing about what Alfred said? Just the notion notion that fighting these battles for emergent media in court over obscenity is a rite of passage for generations to take on the mantle of holding the moral high ground and raising their kids, I think is actually a really interesting and enlightening point.
So we got our first point that video game violence is obscene. The courts disagree for the reasons we covered, because you can't fit the Miller test to make it work that way. Point number 2, and this is a big one, and it eventually will be a whole episode. Exposure to video game violence is harmful to children. Now, another key argument is that violent video games cause some kind of emotional or psychological harm. Video games desensitize people to violence, or they make people more aggressive, or it could even eventually lead to people committing actual real-world acts of violence. And this, in fact, was baked into legally used bills. He justified the California bill in public health terms, saying, quote, exposing minors to depictions of violence in video games, including sexual and heinous violence, makes those minors more likely to experience feelings of aggression, to experience a reduction of activity in the frontal lobes of the brain, and to exhibit violent, antisocial, or aggressive behavior. Even minors who do not commit acts of violence suffer psychological harm for prolonged exposure to violent video games. The state has a compelling interest in preventing violent, aggressive, and antisocial behavior, and in preventing psychological or neurological harm to minors who play violent video games. So effectively saying that there's something happening to kids when they're playing video games. And laws banning access to violent video games lean on scientific research that links violent video game to aggression and antisocial behavior. And this was one of the most interesting parts of my research and why it's going to be an episode in itself. So I'm going to give you kind of the Clip Notes version of this, is that the popular understanding is that there's some kind of link between video game violence and aggression, and that psychological studies prove that. Fun fact, the overwhelming majority of those studies were done by one guy, Craig Anderson, who was a professor of psychology at Iowa State University. But the thing is, Anderson's conclusions and people who agree with them are far from universally accepted in the academic community. And Anderson was a witness at a lot of these cases, arguing the link between violence and aggression. But there were also people who came out on the other side and said, one, there's no consensus to this. And two, the methodologies by which these studies have made their conclusions are really messy. Anderson, for example, if you're arguing that there's a link between video game violence and aggression in children, the majority of Craig Anderson's subjects are his own college students. So a lot of them are not the age group you think they would be. Their measures of aggression are really mixed up. Some places have said, well, okay, there's an enhanced level of aggression, but it's really marginal. And it's no different between saying playing a violent video game versus seeing an image of someone pointing a gun. The short version of all of this is that there's not a consensus. And there's a lot of questions about how people who claim that they've made definitive links have come to their conclusions. The other part of it is that the majority of these kinds of studies don't measure long-term things. They're always like 15 minutes after playing video games, an hour after playing video games. And what other scholars have argued is like, we're not seeing a month out. We're not seeing 5 months out. We're not seeing a year out. We're not seeing 10 years out. People are exposed to a lot of different things in 10 years. And to say that it's violent video games is the one specific cause is not really representing a person's exposure. So all that's to say is that that kind of argument has been way more persuasive for the courts than this idea that there's a direct link between video games and violence. So for example, in the Washington case, the court found no scientific evidence to support the claim that violence against law enforcement officials, remember that was the one that banned violence against cops. The court found no scientific evidence to support the claim that violence against law enforcement officers in games such as Grand Theft Auto translated to violence against them in real life, saying, quote, the court finds that the legislature's belief that video games cause violence, particularly violence against law enforcement officers, is not based on reasonable inferences drawn from substantial evidence. So they argue video game violence is obscene. The courts disagree. They argue that video game violence causes real harm. The courts disagree. The third one, which leads into that one, which is violent video gameplay leads to violent crime. And video game sales have been skyrocketing, especially in the 2000s. More and more people are playing video games. Video games are becoming part of the monoculture at that point. You would think then that there's been a crime spike.
Well, I mean, yeah, I can't go for a drive without a random person just yanking me out of my car and taking my car and then driving over 10 cops immediately. So
it's a goddamn epidemic. I can't
It's hard to recover from a day like that. And then you get to the office and they're like, how was your drive in? And you're like, I don't want to talk about it.
So yeah, by that logic, with video game sales rising steadily, there must be an increase in crime, except that didn't happen. According to the FBI's uniform crime statistics, between 2000 and 2009, the national violent crime rate was falling steadily. It continued for, I think, a decade after that. Even people are arguing about increasing crime rates. They are significantly lower than they were 20 and even 30 years ago. but maybe we need to look more at the juvenile crime. And so I looked into that. The Department of Justice measures crime rates among youths, usually on arrest records. So I will say that it can be considered a problematic statistic because it's people being arrested for specific crimes, not a measure of those crimes. But for the sake of argument, let's say that this is a measurement of crime rates. If people being arrested for vandalism and petty theft and burglary and murder and arson and all that stuff, that this is the measurement of what we're going for. According to the U.S. Department of Justice, Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention, youth violent crime rates were also falling during this time. They fell every year between 2000 and 2009, with one exception. There was a slight spike in 2005. However, even taking that spike into account, in 2005, crime rates were almost 30% lower than they were in 1995. So they were substantially down. But going back to Leland E., maybe the real problem is in lawless liberal California. Maybe Leland E. is dealing with some shit over in California and in San Francisco. Fortunately, as it turns out, there's a group called the Center on Juvenile Criminal Justice, which is based in California, which in 2006, the year after this bill was passed, did a huge study on youth crime rates in California. They measured them over 3 timelines. One was over 30 years, from 1975 to 2005. Then it was 10 years, so it was 1995 to 2005. And then it was over 3 years, so from 2002 to 2005. And they also measured in different cities. They even did San Francisco, so we can see San Francisco crime rates for juveniles. And what they found is that the youth crime rates in California in 2005 were the lowest they had been in 30 years. In Yee's hometown of San Francisco, youth crime rates had been falling significantly. They fell 41% over 30 years. They fell 45% over 10 years. And over 3 years between 2002 and 2005, they fell almost 20%. So even in California, there's no link there. It's not happening. As the study concluded, quote, temporary trends and year-to-year changes notwithstanding, an examination of the official data show that young people in nearly every city in California and their surrounding counties are less delinquent than any generation in many decades.
So, Kev, I'm assuming that one of these cases makes it to the Supreme Court, right?
Skipping ahead, spoiler, all of this is going to explain why video games have First Amendment protection. So let's go into point number 4 then. So we've had video game violence is obscene. Courts disagree because you can't define obscenity that way. Video game violence is linked to aggression and things like that. There's no scientific consensus on that. Video games is leading to higher rates of crime. Crime rates are the lowest that they've been in 3 decades. Point number 4, this we talked about a few minutes ago, so I'll keep it short. That video games, because they're interactive, are more dangerous than other media. That because video games are interactive, because you're actually physically acting out. So you're actually stealing a car in Grand Theft Auto. You're actually ripping off a person's head in Mortal Kombat. That means they're more dangerous than, watching a movie, than watching a TV show, than reading a violent comic book or what have you. However, the courts have always disagreed on this when it comes up and basically argue, I think something we've pointed out already is like, you cannot say that one form of free expression is different from another just because it's new. So video games are no less entitled to free speech as a form of free expression than the theater, than novels, than film. I love this line from Arnold Morris Shepard, who was the judge in the St. Louis case, said, quote, if the First Amendment is versatile enough to shield the painting of Jackson Pollock, the music of Arnold Schoenberg, or Jabberwocky verse of Lewis Carroll, we see no reason why the pictures, graphic design, concept art, sounds, music, stories, and narrative presented in video games are not entitled to similar protection. The mere fact that they appear in a novel medium is of no legal consequence. Not only that, you can't say that film isn't interactive. We saw the discourse over The Last Jedi. We know it's interactive. Like, anybody who argues that film and media are not interactive has never seen the discourse in geek culture, like, at all. So yeah, those are 4 points. And the 5th point that we'll cover here is that on top of all that, the current measures in place are ineffective at keeping violent video games out of the reach of children. As I mentioned at the beginning, part of Leland Eads' argument is that the ESRB is useless, that it's not doing what it needs to, that it's a fox guarding the henhouse, that it's not protecting kids. And actually, the data also doesn't match up with that. So the Federal Trade Commission throughout the 2000s would every couple of years measure the self-reported media rating systems. So the Entertainment Software Ratings Board for the games industry, the Motion Picture Association of America's film rating system, and the parental advisory labels for the recording industry. And they would measure how well do parents know about them and how well are they being enforced. The way they do awareness is mostly through polls, but the way they do the enforcement thing is that they hire secret shoppers who I guess are underage or look underage, and their job is to go into stores and try to buy an R-rated movie or an unrated movie, try to buy an M-rated game, try to buy a parental advisory thing, and see if they get stopped. And they measure that in percentages of how often they're turned away. I've got the 2009 report here. So I'm using that because that's around when the Supreme Court case happens. So we've got the MPAA, we've got the RIA, that's the parental advisory, and we've got the ESRB. If we were to rank these from, say, worst to best, in terms of turning people away from getting them, what's the ranking for these things?
I would say that video games do the best in enforcement and music does the worst in enforcement.
I might say maybe video games best, but movie tickets the worst.
This isn't movie tickets. This is people going in and like buying a DVD.
Oh, right. Yeah, then I think DVD sales would be the worst.
I kind of think that DVDs probably would be the best, music the worst.
So this study does it from 2000 to 2009. They found that the ESRB was the best, the second was the MPAA, and the worst was the RIA. Let's use 2006 as a case study, because that's roughly when the bill was passed. In 2006, underage secret shoppers could get a hold of an M-rated game about 42% of the time. Meanwhile, the same year, they could buy an unrated or an R-rated DVD 71% of the time, and a parental advisory CD about 76% of the time. So out of every 4 underage people who went to buy a parental advisory thing, 3 of them came away with it. And those numbers continued to decrease for the games industry in particular. By 2009, the turnover rate in terms of people coming out with an M-rated game who were underage was 20%. Now, if I were to guess, probably a lot of that is because there was a lot more scrutiny on the ESRB than there was on the RIA and the MPAA. But to say that the video game industry is not really doing well, if we're going to do a what about argument, what about the record industry? What are they doing? What of the film industry? They seem to have significantly worse levels of enforcement. And I know the percentages are generally pretty high about awareness of the ESRB through this time. And part of that might be because it was involved in a lot of controversies. All of this is to say, these 5 points, that for a law to be upheld that restricts a certain constitutional right, in this case, speech, it has to pass something in the courts that's called strict scrutiny. And to pass strict scrutiny, a law must answer 2 questions. First, does the law have a compelling reason for being? In this case, will a law banning minors' access to so-called violent video games curtail violence or aggression or violent crime? And the second is this law the least restrictive way of doing that? Is the only way you can make sure that violent crime rates aren't going up and aggression rates and things like that are going up is to ban access and fine people and things like that? Is that the least restrictive way of doing it? We tried everything else and nothing else has worked. And we know we need to have this. And those 2 points in strict scrutiny are the things why all of these laws fail. For all the 5 reasons we've covered, because video game violence does not fit in obscenity laws, so we can't say video game violence is obscene. There isn't a scientific consensus that video games cause psychological harm. There's no direct relationship between video game consumption and violent crime. There's no compelling evidence that video gaming is much different than any forms of entertainment. And the ESRB overall has proven pretty effective at restricting youth access to M-rated games. So all of those reasons are why these laws keep failing, because they cannot jump the hurdle of strict scrutiny. And I will say, all of these failed attempts come at a great expense to the taxpayer. So in addition to the time and effort wasted by state attorneys general offices, when a state lost a case, representatives of the games industry generally petitioned the courts to have the state pay for their legal expenses. And every time the courts overturn these laws, they've ruled in favor of the games industry for the state to pay their legal expenses. And so as a result of that, taxpayers are paying for all of this to happen. So for example, the failed ultra-violent explicit video games law for Michigan, that cost the taxpayers of Michigan $182,349 in back legal fees to the Entertainment Software Association. That same year, the Illinois bill cost $510,000. Jack Thompson's bill, this is one thing to Jack Thompson's credit, he had one of the cheaper ones. His law only cost Louisiana taxpayers $91,000. And a 2007 Ars Technica report noted that by September of 2007, these failed laws had cost taxpayers over $1 million. And in addition to depriving these states of money that could have gone for roads or schools or, anything of value, these cases helped create a body of legal precedent. Because one thing that wasn't there in the 80s and the 1990s when they start arguing these cases, there was no precedent. In the 2000s, there is, because these cases go into the courts, they fail, and they build a body of reasons why. This is a long way of getting us back to California's AB 1179. I promise we would get back to Leland Yee's bill. On October 17, 2005, representatives of the games and video game retail industry sue the state of California. They file an injunction to block the law while it goes to the courts, and the courts grant them the injunction in December. 2 years later, on August 6, 2007, the U.S. District Court of the Northern District of California ruled the law was unconstitutional for pretty much all of the reasons we've already covered. However, However, Governor Schwarzenegger filed an appeal only for the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals to affirm the lower court's ruling on February 28, 2009. Again, for all of the reasons we've already covered. But Schwarzenegger wasn't done there. Despite defeats in 2 federal courts and failures in at least 6 other states, Schwarzenegger appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court, and this time around, the Supreme Court took the case on April the 26th, 2010. Oral arguments took place on November the 2nd, 2010. I'm not going to belabor a lot of the points because a lot of it's stuff we've already covered, but representing the state of California was Zachary P. Morozini, who was the Deputy Attorney General for the state of California. On the side of the Entertainment Merchants Association was a guy named Paul M. Smith. Paul M. Smith is a pretty big name in Supreme Court law, particularly when it comes to civil rights. He is the lawyer who successfully argued Lawrence v. Texas in 2002. That is the landmark Supreme Court case that put down the anti-sodomy law in Texas and became a really groundbreaking case for LGBTQ rights. They got a heavy hitter for this one. And on June 27, 2011, the Supreme Court upheld the lower court's rulings and officially affirmed that video games qualify for free speech protection by a 7-2 margin. The ones who affirmed the ruling were Chief Justice John Roberts, Samuel Alito, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Alina Kagan, Anthony Kennedy, and Antonin Scalia. Scalia delivered the court's opinion, concluding that video games qualified for free speech protection, saying, quote, like the protected books, plays, and movies that preceded them, video games communicate ideas and even social messages through many familiar literary devices such as characters, dialogue, plot, and music, and through features distinctive to the medium, such as the player's interaction with the virtual world. That suffices to confer free speech protection. And much of the ruling, it's playing the greatest hits of all the stuff we've already covered. That you can't shoehorn violence into the Miller test, that violence is common in children's media like the Odyssey and Grimm's fairy tales, that video games aren't different because they're more interactive, because all good media is interactive. And he also found the body of evidence about the link between video games and violent behavior, guys like Craig Anderson, unconvincing. And he also pointed out that, the ESRB is already in place. That's a less restrictive point of action than legislation. And I think what's interesting about Scalia is he also pointed out for something that tried to restrict something that was so problematic, video game violence is causing children to, have violent and aggressive behaviors. He found it interesting that the law only restricted the point of sale. So it only banned whether you could buy it. He said, quote, the California legislature is perfectly willing to leave this dangerous, mind-altering material in the hands of children so long as one parent or even an aunt or uncle says it's okay. And there are not even requirements as to how this parental or avuncular relationship is to be verified. Apparently the child or putative parents, aunts, or uncles say so suffices. This is not how one addresses a serious social problem. The dissenting opinions in this were Clarence Thomas and Stephen Breyer. Both of them wrote a dissenting opinion. Stephen Breyer leaned on the works of Craig Anderson, primarily as evidence that there was a scientific link between video games and violence. And Clarence Thomas, if you know anything about Clarence Thomas, in terms of his ideology, is a strict constructionist, I believe the term is called. People who advocate for that argue for any kind of law in terms of the original intent of the founders. And it is fascinating reading his ruling of how the original founding fathers would have thought about video games. It is rambling and slightly unhinged. So all of this effectively ended the legal headaches of the 2000s, as it's very difficult to overturn a Supreme Court ruling, save for a bunch of whole new precedent, a whole bunch of new justices, or a constitutional amendment.
Especially now that video games, they make more money than the film industry at this point. So I feel like certainly the money from lobbyists would not be leaning against video games nowadays.
Agreed. And I think that's one of the testaments of this particular case too, is that one of the things that the video game industry had in the 2000s, they did not have in the 80s and the 1990s, was a lobbying group. And they created a lobbying organization in 1994, the Interactive Digital Software Association, because Congress was breathing down their necks and said, either you regulate yourselves or we'll do it. And they realized we need to get our shit together. So they finally had a body together that could more effectively lobby in Congress, that could build up a legal defense fund, things like that. And so I think you make a good point, is like the amount of money the games industry is bringing in is making them a lot more powerful to make it a lot less likely you're going to see something like that. That doesn't stop various political and activist groups, though, from blaming video games. But I will say that it did significantly limit their courses of action after 2011. So they could blame video games for all sorts of social ills, but there's not a lot they could really do about that, aside from like calls for more research. So for example, in January 2013, in the wake of the the December 14th, 2012 mass shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School, then Vice President Joe Biden met with representatives of the games industry to discuss their public image. And President Barack Obama later called upon the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, to look into the relationship between depictions of violence in the media, including video games and real life violence. And again, we'll do a whole episode on violent video game studies because it's actually really fascinating. This has happened on the other side of political aisle. That was some Democrats doing it. Republicans pull this kind of stuff too. So for example, following the mass shooting at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School in Parkland, Florida on February 14, 2018, several prominent Republicans, including Donald Trump, came out to try to blame it on video games. Trump at one point said, quote, "I'm hearing more and more people say the level of violence on video games is really shaping young people's thoughts." And on March the 8th, 2018, the Trump administration released a compilation video of violent video game scenes from various AAA games, I guess trying to say, it's the video games that really did it. And there were a bunch of other prominent Republicans who came out in these kinds of issues. For example, after a pair of mass shootings in El Paso, Texas and Dayton, Ohio on August the 4th, 2019, House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy and Texas Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick both cited violent video games as a potential cause of the violence. Goodness knows it's not access to guns or anything. But oddly enough, this hasn't stopped some galaxy-brained politicians from trying to pass these kinds of laws anyway. For example, on February the 22nd, 2021, Illinois State Representative Marcus C. Evans Jr. introduced a bill to ban violent video games in the state of Illinois. The reason? There was an uptick of carjackings in Chicago, and he attributed the increase to Grand Theft Auto 5, a game that had been around since 2013. However, when pressed on the bill by a Chicago Tribune reporter, Evans took a really non-committal approach to his own bill, saying, quote, "Taking a stance against something, making it crystal clear that it's unacceptable can send shockwaves." Or maybe not. It's just an idea. If people don't like my ideas, I'm open to not advancing them. The bill was referred to committee after its introduction, where it remains as of this recording.
Carrying on in the proud tradition of Illinois politicians, Rod Blagojevich smiles down on him.
What would be funny is if it turns out the person who was doing all of the carjackings was Rod Blagojevich. He got out of prison. He has no means. His political career is over.
Just a serial carjacker now.
Yeah.
Hold on to that thought about corrupt politicians, because I'm going to end our rather long tale by going back to our old buddy Leland Yee. In 2006, Leland Yee ran for state senate and he won in a landslide. He was also in the runnings for mayor of San Francisco in 2011 and California's secretary of state in 2014. Now, do you recall what I said his two key issues were?
Like the welfare
protecting
of children.
Yeah, welfare of children. What was the second one? Government transparency. This is where that becomes important.
That's right. I said I liked it about him.
On March the 26th, 2014, Leland Yee received a visit to his home from FBI agents who's hauled the state senator away in handcuffs and charged him with massive corruption.
Corruption? No, Leland, no.
Now, if it were just a
You are
regular
my
amount
friend.
of corruption, that'd be one thing. But like a massive amount, I can't overlook that.
Wait till you hear what they got him on. This is my favorite part of the story. As it turns out, at the time of his arrest, Yee had accepted about $42,800 in bribes from undercover federal agents. But that's not all. He was also involved in a scheme alongside a local Chinatown gangster named Raymond Shrimp Guy Chow, an international arms dealer called The Russian, and a separatist group in the Philippines to smuggle millions of dollars worth of weapons, including automatic weapons and shoulder-mounted missiles, into the United States.
Wow.
Dude who's advocating for bans on video games because of violence is an arms dealer. So yeah, the guy who argued video games are causing real-life harm was working on smuggling millions of dollars worth of weapons that would cause a whole bunch of real-life harm.
I mean, in his defense, though, I don't know how many people are carjacked at point of shoulder-mounted missile.
That's a fair point.
I would get the fuck out the car. I don't know about you.
That's some kind of carjack.
On July the 1st, 2015, Yee pled guilty to racketeering, accepting bribes, and attempted arms trafficking. On February the 14th, 2016, he was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison and fined $20,000. He was released from prison on January the 30th, 2020.
How much hard labor did he have to serve while he was in prison, though?
I don't know how many video games he tried to sell to minors, so I don't know.
Oh, all right, good point.
So final thoughts on this journey we've taken through the legal system.
You know, it's nice to see free speech prevail.
I'm just curious as to how much more blinding people with science is going to promulgate throughout the legal system. Like, it is stuff like Brown versus EMA. Is that the start? Or as we become more ingrained in technology in our everyday use, are we just going to see more and more specious reasoning for some sort of agenda around the use of technology?
Yeah, that's a good point. I would imagine it's kind of like what we were talking about earlier, how just each generation has its own bugbears, and like each generation also has its own, just like you understand technology up to like a certain year. And then things after that are very just bewildering to you. And so, in 15 years, all the judges will have grown up playing video games, but they won't necessarily have grown up playing Roblox or, whatever the next thing is.
Or shaking it on TikTok.
Yeah.
Please don't ban that.
One of the things we touched on that I thought was kind of the heart of all of this is that initially when, Kevin, you told us about this law, basically they're going to try to ban violent video games for children, which in some means makes sense. I quickly think to myself, well, then who's going to get to interpret what violence is, right? And that's kind of the heart of the problem that they have with legislating most things. Now, you discussed the Miller test, which was new to me, but as soon as you start trying to ban these violent video games, I'm sure there are people wanting to call this game violent versus that game violent. And it's hard to find a game that doesn't actually have violence in it. So like Super Mario, probably the first game I played, and the whole game is actually killing monsters. That's the whole game. That's the point of the game. Now, it doesn't depict things as graphically as Grand Theft Auto or one of these newer games does. But still, once you say violence, then you have to figure out who's going to interpret that. And that law you mentioned about the state of Washington banning games that depicted violence towards police officers just goes to show, well, violence to police officers, that's not a good thing. But why do we have to particularly ban that game versus a game that shows violence towards another type of person, right? That's all just based on perspective. And that's going to make it very confusing for the markets. But it's also going to not really be helpful for parents in the end, especially when their children have to recognize that these rules aren't really making any sense in terms of what games that they can play and what games they can't play.
Yeah, I think all those are good points. And before I make my final points, I kind of piggyback off that, Alfred, is that another big issue comes with these laws is oftentimes their definition of violence is really vague, and it's very much in the eye of the beholder. So this is how Yee's bill defined it. It said, quote, a video game in which the range of options available to a player includes killing, maiming, dismembering, or sexually assaulting an image of a human being. And then, quote, enables the player to virtually inflict serious injury upon images of human beings or characters with substantially human characteristics in a manner which is especially heinous, cruel, or depraved in that it involves torture or serious physical abuse to the victim. Now, there's a couple of things about this. One, someone's definition of heinous and cruel is going to vary. And so having to try to find a way of defining that. And also, is violence against human characters not okay, but like robots? In fact, that was actually something that came up in the Supreme Court cases. Like someone had said, like, what if they're just all robots and they're inflicting cruel things? Is that okay versus a person? And so a lot of the question is where the line is. And it's one thing to say we need to stop kids' access to violent video games, but I think that logic needs more examination because we all have our different qualifications of what is too extreme in terms of violence. And you brought the example, is Super Mario Bros. Too violent? Because, you cruelly stomp to death those poor Goombas and turtles versus, Mortal Kombat where you're ripping a person's spine out or whatever. And it goes back to that whole, I don't know what obscenities, but I know what it looks like. And that becomes one of the problems of these laws. It's trying to capture a feeling of people. We need to do something about violent video games. And so we're going to make a law banning violent video games. And that kind of goes into my final point, which is that moral panics cannot sustain themselves over long periods of time. They're designed for short bursts. Something happens, like, say, a mass shooting, and people try to find causes for this and say, we need to do something about violent video games, and we need to do it now. Maybe in the case of what we've been talking here, we pass a law banning the sale of violent video games. But the problem is that the courts don't work that way. The courts are not a quick reaction, sudden burst of energy. They work slowly. They work meticulously. Going back to Leland Yee's bill, it passed in 2005. It was finally ruled unconstitutional in 2011, 6 years after that. That's a long time to maintain that kind of energy, the immediacy that we need to do something about it. One of the things that moral panics don't often hold up to is deeper scrutiny. And people who try to capitalize on the emotions of that need something to happen in a hurry. Because again, either something else is going to happen that's going to direct our attention, or people are going to start paying more attention and thinking about the nuance of this issue. issue rather than, okay, we need to stop kids getting access to violent video games. Like, okay, well, do video games exposure, do they have negative effects to children? What kinds of violence are we talking about? And are there other ways in society that we can discourage violent acts? Like, I don't know, regulating guns or something, increasing people's access to things that can actually kill people, not listening to Li Li and his deals with the Russian and all that. And I think that's an interesting thing that comes out of this, is that the law has a lot of problems, and there are a lot of places where there are Supreme Court cases that I think made the wrong decision. I don't think this is one of them. And I think what they did is they took the impulse that people had and they dissected it, and they found maybe we have the face value of this thing as an issue, but digging deep in that, it's not. So why don't we conclude that?
Hold on. I have something I want to say.
Sure.
Andy, I just want you to know, I appreciate your willingness to help me, but you're off the hook. I feel like after Kevin's in-depth explanation of the legal process, I feel pretty comfortable representing myself in traffic court. But thank you, man.
I mean, I usually don't recommend my clients to represent themselves, but, you're an adult and you can make these decisions yourself. But, if something happens that you need to appeal the decision, you know how to get in touch with me.
Thank you.
And that will do it for today's episode of Scandalous Games. If you like what we're doing and want to help the show, subscribe or follow us wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a rating on iTunes. If you want to learn more, check out our website, scandalousgamespodcast.wordpress.com, where I publish the show notes and the sources for every episode. Our theme music is Occam Seekweed by Seek Knowledge via the Free Music Archive. Use under a CC BY-NC SA 3.0 US license. And if you have a question, comment, or idea for a topic for a future episode, email us at scandalousgamespodcast@gmail.com. Until next time, I'm Kevin Impellizzeri.
I'm Alfred Stevens.
I'm Phil Thomas.
And I'm Andy Hunter.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next Scandal.